So, thanks very much for joining me today on World Tourism Day. The UN system has decided that we should discuss peace this year. I guess the reason for that is pretty obvious with major conflicts going on in the Sudan and in the Middle East and in the Ukraine. It seems like a really important thing to be discussing. There's often an assumption in travel and tourism that tourism contributes to peace. I think it's fairly well known that I'm a bit skeptical about this, but I've got three people joining me in this conversation this afternoon who I think take a more optimistic view about how travel and tourism can contribute to peace. So Paige McClanahan is here. She has just published a book called The New Tourist, which is getting a lot of media attention, and rightly so, pursuing an optimistic view about a new kind of tourism. I hope you're right about that, Paige, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure, as we discuss this. And we've got Scott Cooper, who, with Aziz Abu Sarah, runs Meshki Tours, of which I am a great fan. And they're famous for having started dual narrative tours, but I won't steal their thunder. I'll let them explain what they do and why they do it and how successful or not it is. But I wanted to start with the quotation we so often hear about from Mark Twain about travel broadening the mind. What he actually said was that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Paige, what do you think about that? Has he got it right?
Yeah, I think Mark Twain is a fellow optimist along with me, and I use that quote in my book as well. I mean, I think, there are so many different ways that we can do tourism. There are so many different ways that we can be tourists. And yes, I'm an optimist on one hand, but I also like to think of myself as a realist. And I see all the sides of tourism. I see that tourism can be incredibly constructive and, it can be really engaging and it can teach us a lot of things, a lot of important things. At the same time, tourism can be incredibly destructive, right? And it can close our minds and it can damage places and it can, damage cultures and, can damage the environment. So I think it's really important that we hold these two possibilities for tourism, kind of that we hold space for both of them. And, in doing so, that allows us to envision, to lean into the positive aspects of tourism. So I think, Mark Twain is correct, but that doesn't mean that there isn't another side of tourism that we need to guard against as well as tourists, as tour operators, and as, governments that are working to manage tourism too.
You seem to be suggesting that they're both equally common as forms of tourism experience. Are you serious about that?
No, I don't think, well, I mean, I think all of them exist. I mean, they all exist within me, right? As a tourist, I've been a pure consumer when I've traveled before. I've traveled to places and just to get the picture or talk about it and not really engaged in any depth. And I know that I've been a very different type of tourist too, somebody who's much more sort of open-minded, higher-minded when I travel. So all of these things, which one is more common? I would like to think that we as a society are moving toward a more nuanced understanding of tourism and what it means. I mean, I think the discussions that we saw in the media this summer around the impacts of tourism have really, penetrated into the consciousness of Western society more and more. We're really waking up to the dangers of tourism, what we need to be aware of. So I hope that we're all learning to lean into the positive and be more wary of the negative aspects of tourism. But yeah, we have a long way to go, that's for sure.
What you've just said is reminding me of the quote from Joss Krippendorf, who wrote The Holidaymakers back in the 80s, when he said that we need to be reminded that every individual tourist builds up or destroys human values while traveling. It seems to me that we do that. I was talking to somebody on Peace Radio earlier this week and pointing out that the attitude of my parents' generation to American GIs who were in Britain for the D-Day landings, grateful though we were for that contribution. My parents' generation talked about Americans as being overpaid, over here, and oversexed, because that was their experience of American travelers as soldiers at that time, and one can understand why that was the case. Aziz, you spend probably more time actually traveling with groups than any of the rest of us on this call. What's your sense of how people travel? Do they travel with open minds, or are their minds basically closed and need to be opened? Aziz, you're muted.
I know. The Zoom trying to silence me, Harold. I think because I travel a lot with groups and groups who've been traveling with Majdi tours, I have a bit of a very optimistic probably outlook because I get to see people who are changing through the trips, people who engage in peace building on their tours, and people who counter even the stereotype and racism. I'll give you an example from this week. I was with a group of Muslim and Jewish women who traveled together to Andalusia with me and with an Israeli Jewish tour guide. We both co-led the trip, and we decided to engage with the Muslim and Jewish communities in Andalusia. And we had really positive encounters with both communities until Friday evening when we were supposed to go to a Shabbat service with one of the Jewish communities. And literally 10 minutes before, which you don't have much time to negotiate because the moment Shabbat starts, we can't get on the phone. They they freaked out because of the news, that Jewish community. And they were like, oh, we're not sure we want to have Muslims come and visit our synagogue. And then they said, okay, we'll have Muslims, but not Palestinians. I was the only Palestinian in the group. And I told the group, look, I understand they're afraid. I don't want to affect your trip. You go to do your Sabbath, your Shabbat. And the Jewish members in the group decided we will not do it. We will not go to a place that is racist or biased or prejudiced toward our fellow traveler. And so decided instead to get together and do our own Shabbat service. Muslim women, Jewish women, and me and my Israeli counterpart or my Israeli colleague. And it was a million times more meaningful in some ways. And so those things happen when you travel. These women made that decision through a trip. We became friends through this trip. We became partners through the trip. So I see many examples like this. Now, I'm also, like Paige said, I understand that's not how everyone travel. I understand this is not yet the norm. But my hope is more and more and more people will travel in this way.
Scott, you're also part of Measure. You're a business partner with Aziz, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that later. But you very much sit in the office. You take the inquiries from people. Do you get people approaching Mejdi who are perhaps, well, people who've not travelled with you before, perhaps coming with an open mind, looking for something different? Are you aware of that as one of the groups that finds your tours and finds them interesting?
I think over the years, we've had many, many different types of travelers come to us. So since we don't only work B2C, we also work B2B. We've had the opportunity to work with groups and with travelers coming into this with a whole bunch of different intentions. And just the question makes me think about one of the companies that we are a white label provider for. They cater to a pretty high-end luxury demographic, and we brought their groups to Israel and Palestine for many years. And I know a lot of their travelers didn't come with exactly the idea of, they hadn't read about us or heard about what we did, but they ended up coming on the trip, and their minds changed relatively quickly within the course of traveling with us. So I bring up this point to say that depending on how this is more for the tour operators and for the people curating the experiences. I think depending on how you arrange that, you can facilitate experiences that are more prone to be able to open people's minds. So I think we do have travelers who read about us and then come to us and say that they want to do this. And I know that we have some, for example, like the B2B markets, maybe they're coming with that intention, maybe they're not, but relatively quickly, and we have this experience in conflict zones all over the world, we will see people's minds open. And this is something that I'd say, I don't know if it's only unique to Mejdi, but coming from peace building and conflict resolution backgrounds and creating what we call interventions in conflict zones or programs in conflict zones, this is something that we knew how to do before. And we bring that into the program design, and not just the program design, but even who is it that we're putting together? Like, for example, Aziz and I as a symbol, or Aziz with an Israeli partner, symbolically, Aziz being Palestinian, I'm Jewish, or working with an Israeli partner, and then putting us, even though in the conflict, or, depending on who's talking about it, there's, somebody has different status than the other. We specifically make sure that we're equals in this. And I think in conflict resolution, if you're creating situations where people are entering this as equals with a common goal, you can really create positive change.
Have you had examples where it hasn't worked?
Aziz, what have we had anywhere where it just completely failed?
I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'm also thinking. I mean,
or maybe where you get people who come on the trip, but they're not open to the type of travel that you
funny,
guys espouse.
Aziz, you might have some stories, but I remember
Yeah. I've had individuals, not groups, that have probably. I think we did have a couple. It's very rare, but we've had some. I can tell you, for example, I took a group to Morocco, and one person in that trip loves France so much that she couldn't hear anyone talking about the French colonization of Morocco and the history of that, totally rejected it and was hostile because in her mind, France can do no wrong. And there are people who have decided a country can do no wrong and its history cannot change. We've had few travelers who come to Israel and Palestine, a group, for example, that comes to my mind that have decided they only want to learn about anti-Semitism and how it's impacting the world, and they're not open to hearing anything from Palestinians, Muslims, Islamophobia, as if it's a competition between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But I would say those are so minimal. Like those are the outlier examples, not the rule. That most of our travelers are the exact opposite.
Paige, has any of this come up in your conversations with journalists and social media and so on over the last couple of months while you've been talking about these issues?
Well, I mean, just hearing, Aziz and Scott talk about their business and how they run it. I mean, I think, one question that does come up is kind of the question that you put to me earlier, Harold, is like how common is this, or how scalable is this, or how much can we really kind of bring this to a wider audience? And I think more and more people are leaning in this direction. But the important message to share, and I know this is a message that Scott and Aziz really espouse as well, is that this, an approach to travel that is really leaning into shifting your perspective and maybe putting you into contact with people whose backgrounds or perspectives are different from your own. I mean, this might take some more work up front, but it's also a lot of fun, and it's also, can be deeply rewarding in the end. So I think, if we're talking about how do we move toward a new approach to tourism, or how do we encourage a wider shift toward a new approach to tourism, I think really encouraging people to see it as, a win-win situation, a win for you, the traveler, as well as a win for hopefully the place that you're visiting as well, and something that might require a little bit more investment in terms of time and maybe emotion, but one that will really pay off in the long term.
One of the things that I think is one of the problems about the way we think about tourism is that we often forget the Tourism Concern campaign, which ran for about 15 years, making the point that we take our holidays in somebody else's home. And we forget that in that there are two power relationships operating. One is that as tourists, we're often spending more per day than we would at home, and often spending therefore far more than local people are able to spend in a day. So we're economically powerful in their place, and that causes all kinds of disruptions to their lives. But the other power relationship, which is the one we never talk about, is the question of who has the right to define what a place is. And the organizations which market places, the way in which they market a place, I can find sometimes quite offensive in terms of what I know about that place and the way it's being marketed as somewhere completely different from the place I know. Now, one of the things that Mejdi does, which I think is stunning about your work, is that you take people to places which are perceived very differently by different groups of people. Yeah, seen by one side as something, by another side as, and sometimes there are 3 or 4 other groups who've also got a different view of that place. But embedded in tourism is this critical question of who defines what the significance of a place is. And if I may, Aziz, let me take you to Cape Town and the District 6 Museum, because I'm absolutely convinced if the District 6 Museum, which is a museum about one of the last clearances made by the apartheid government in South Africa, which happened while I was at school, which is why I find it particularly offensive. It happened during my lifetime. If that was in New York, it would be a top 10 attraction. In Cape Town, many tour operators don't feature it, don't offer it. And I've met many progressive tour operators in the UK who don't know it's there. Now, that's partly because they haven't done their research well enough, but it's also because the industry has chosen to omit that part of its history. And you and I had the experience of going to that wonderful exhibition of statues of the people involved in the Long March to Freedom. I don't know, did that have the same impact on you that it did on me? Aziz.
I keep getting silenced by my own self now. I think it's absolutely made a huge impact on me, and just visiting the District 6 Museum and then visiting where District 6 would have been and the people who live there, and seeing their homes is still in ruins. You can see still the roads that led to the homes, and then you go to the District 6 Museum and you learn about the stories, and you see the faces of people, you see the documentation of colored, of white, of black, even the whole idea that people weren't just white and black in South Africa, which is often the story we hear, but that there was a category of people who were colored. It's something, for at least I know, for people in the US, most people I meet have no idea about that. So it has tremendous impact. But I think I noticed it wasn't even only District 6 Museum. I have a lot of tour companies I'm aware of that I have friends who work there, and we talk about places like Joburg. Johannesburg is an airport stop. You know, you got the Apartheid Museum, you got Constitution Hill, which also is an extremely powerful place to visit. You have so many rich stories that are missing, because when people think of South Africa, they think of, you know, Table Mountain, and they think of safari, and they think of, and these are beautiful things, and I'm not saying you should ignore them, but there's a much bigger story that is sometimes sidelined when people go to South Africa, and that's just a sad reality, and it can be fixed, and it should be fixed, because to me those were the places that have impacted me the most when I was there, and seeing a leopard that did feel cool.
You want to just say something about where the idea for Mejdi Tours came from? Because as far as I know, you're still fairly unique. I don't know of anyone else doing what you're doing. Could you just, one of you, just pack in the history for us?
Yeah, I'll let Scott do it, but it's a story of two very brilliantly smart young men. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, as I was talking about before, Aziz and I, prior to founding Mejdi, we co-directed a center on religion, diplomacy, and conflict resolution at a school for conflict analysis and resolution, and we participated in and curated projects all over the world. And one of the projects that one of the opportunities that we saw, and frustrations, the frustration was that these programs were very limited in scope in terms of who could participate. And so we saw an opportunity to take some of what we knew how to do and bring it to tourism, because tourism would involve so many more people. And we could, like Aziz was saying, we could start sharing more of these narratives, more of these stories that are sidelined. And by doing that, we saw our ability to create change differently, and we had a much bigger pool of people to work with. So that's one of the main reasons that we started Mejdi Tours. And just to add to that, we had seen already in some of these conflict zones the people from the different parties working together, and we thought from the tourist perspective, there's a lot of people that are really intellectually curious, and we thought that this would be very interesting to them, and we did not see that in the marketplace. So we just saw something that was an opportunity to create change and bring in these different narratives. And then we saw that people could possibly be thirsty for this. And those were the main reasons why we started the company. Aziz, do you have any more to add?
I think that was good.
I might just jump in and say as a quick reaction to that, I mean, I love the idea that, when you guys founded the company, you turned to tourism as a way to just, really branch out and reach more people with the same message. And I think that's really how I see tourism and how I like to talk about tourism. I mean, because, we're going to have 1.5 billion international tourist arrivals this year, right? And this is, more than ever. And it's just such a huge and potent force. And, like any force, it can sort of, could be used for good or evil. But I think really looking at tourism as something that we need to really try to understand, and we really need to, understand the stakes, and we need to aim to work with this force rather than, I'm so frustrated by media stories that I see that just kind of blame tourists for overcrowding. I mean, not to say that there's not, there aren't issues we need to look into there. But I would really hope that in the media and in just in general conversations about tourism, we acknowledge its the constructive power within it, which is what you guys did back when you founded your company. And yeah, I do wonder how many other companies there are out there that are looking at tourism in the same way. Because I remember, Aziz, when I interviewed you for the New York Times, a couple of years ago, you said really like you guys set out to, with the aim of winning the Nobel Peace Prize when you founded your company, which like I can't imagine there are too many other tour companies out there that had that in mind when they were laying the foundations of their business.
And then I just wanted to add that I think, and Aziz says this in a lot of his talks, is that we see tourism as tourists can be citizen diplomats essentially. So the opportunity for citizen diplomacy, that doesn't mean that necessarily it is that and everybody's doing that, but we have that capacity if we want to do that as travelers. And Aziz and I had seen that, and we wanted to give that opportunity to travelers.
Can we just talk about one of the very specific things which happens on your tours, which is that if you move into a new country, Aziz, and it's mainly you that does that pioneering work, I think, you need to find 2 or 3 people from different groups who are going to co-lead tour groups. How do you actually do that?
It's different in different places, but usually I rely on people I know and connections and friends I've met through the years and ask them for help. So we try not to go to any place we don't have any connection. I'll give you a small example of something recently I wasn't as involved in is Uzbekistan, which is our newest destination that will start next year. And the way we did it is, as a friend of mine reached out to us, Mark Bauman, who is also a friend of Paige. And Mark was a journalist in Uzbekistan, spent a lot of time there, has tons and tons of connections there, including with different communities like the Jewish community, the different Muslim communities, the Russian expat community. And it was like, I see what Mejdi does, and I just can't believe you're not working in Uzbekistan. I said, I can't work in a place I've never been to. I don't know anyone. He's like, it's on me. I'll connect you to everyone. I'm going to help you build the program. We're going to build the itinerary. We're going to find the real tour guides together. And so Mark, and he did that to help us. This wasn't his job. It's not his work, but he spent the last few months working with us on developing this program as a volunteer, and even agreed to co-lead the first trip with me as a volunteer. And so this has happened in multiple places where we get just friends, people who care about the message we're we are spreading, saying, come to my country or come to this place that I know really well, and I'm going to help you develop it. I'm going to find you with you the tour guides, because there's no way, even, I like to think I'm really good at what I do, but it doesn't matter how good I am at what I do. There's no way I can go to a country I know nothing about with no connection and be able to set something meaningful within 2 or 3 or 4 or even 10 weeks. It takes so much more knowledge than that. And without local knowledge, it's impossible. It also means you're having partnerships with the people who live there, instead of you coming as an outsider saying, here's the story and the narrative I would like to share about these people.
But Aziz, I assume you're also making new partnerships, aren't you? I mean, if you put together a Protestant and a Catholic guide in Northern Ireland to work together for a week or whatever on a program, you're developing a new relationship between two
We
people,
are.
probably, aren't you?
And even Uzbekistan, that where are and now we have so many new relationships. In Northern Ireland, I went with a friend, 2 friends who helped me connect. And while I'm there, I connected with a man named Gary Mason. And Gary is a former pastor. He was pastor when I met him. Actually, he was still working at the church, has a PhD in conflict resolution, been doing a lot of work in different organizations, and connected with him. We started this friendship, partnership. It took few years to mature into doing work together. And now we do a lot of work when we're running tours in Northern Ireland. He's one of our main partners. And then Gary connects me to a woman named Anne, who was an IRA fighter. He's Protestant, she's Catholic, and Anne has become one of our most important people in our work in Northern Ireland. So you build relationships, you build partnerships, and eventually, really what we do becomes less as a Majdi. We're not the ones setting the agenda. Like our itineraries in Northern Ireland is set by Gary and by Anne and by our partners there, because there's no way I would know enough about Northern Ireland, even though I've been there many times. I know a lot about Northern Ireland. I don't know enough to set that agenda.
So as we come into what is effectively really the second half of this conversation, can we perhaps just focus on, it is after all World Tourism Day, the theme is peace. We will get an audience for this video. What should we be saying to travelers and to businesses and governments involved in tourism? What should we be saying to them about how to increase the benefit of tourism in terms of creating international understanding and peace? Paige, on the principle that you are a writer, would you like to go first?
For sure. Maybe I might just start with a quote, actually, to, sort of in parallel with the Mark Twain quote you started with, but it's a quote that actually is sometimes used in part, just a small part of it, to make the argument that an argument against tourism or travel as a sort of potentially mind-opening activity. But I like to read the whole thing, and I use this quote in the last chapter of my book. And it's from G.K. Chesterton, who was a British essayist in the early 20th century. And he says, "I have never managed to lose my old conviction that travel narrows the mind." And this is what we often hear, travel narrows the mind. But then he continues, "At least a man must make a double effort of moral humility and imaginative energy to prevent it from narrowing his mind." And so I think that's lovely. I mean, I like that quote because it holds both of those possibilities, at the same time, right? Travel can narrow our mind. It can be incredibly consumeristic. It can be, very colonial in some ways if you're coming to just sort of occupy the place, use it for your own benefit, impose your presence on the place, and then head out, head home and brag about it to your friends. But it can also be something much higher minded than that. And the path that we need to take to get there, Chesterton tells us we need a double effort of moral humility and imaginative energy. And I think that is really a wonderful place to start and a wonderful message to share with people, especially people, who are travelers, and, going out and exploring the world. Travel with a huge amount of humility and a huge amount of curiosity, and a strong desire to make connections, real connections with people in the place you're visiting. And just an example, like one person I met in my reporting for the book who really inspired me was a woman named Cindy Punahele on the Big Island of Hawaii. Cindy works at Kahului Bay on the Big Island. And she grew up on the Big Island as a native Hawaiian, in a house without running water or electricity. And she sees this bay where she fished, with her family as a child, as a really incredibly potent source of, an incredibly important part of her community. And now she's kind of harnessing the power of the tourists who come to Kahului Bay to snorkel and using them as a sort of a constructive force for the bay's protection. And I describe this in the book. And I was so moved by Cindy and her work. I see her really in the same category as Scott and Aziz, and in the same categories as other people I've met who are trying to harness the power, and doing so with a huge amount of moral humility and imaginative energy. So that would be maybe one message that I would like to pass along.
It does seem to me in the same theme, Paige, that there is an enormous difference between those people who travel with curiosity and their ears open and those who travel and spend most of their time talking. Yeah. There's an enormous difference between those two. So that's a kind of focus on what the individuals can do. Scott, you really run the tour operating side of Mejdi. What do you think businesses can do to try and help people to travel in a more open-minded way?
I can confidently say that everywhere on Earth, there are local people working to solve their conflicts, and at a level that will inspire you immensely. So I would say in terms of businesses, when you're thinking about setting up a program in an area, whether it's a conflict zone or there are other social issues, to think a little bit, kind of like what Paige was saying, like think a little bit creatively or out of the box, and ask yourself, who is similar to what Aziz said too, like who here is actually working on solving this? Because I guarantee it, and I'm happy to speak with anybody who wants to contact me. We know in peace building, conflict resolution, conflict transformation that there are people at the cutting edge of working on solving their problems everywhere. So if we take a step back and involve these folks who are on the ground doing the most important work in the design, and let them, like Aziz was saying, let them design the program. That's how we do that. There's not one place, there's nowhere on Earth that local people are not across divides working to solve their conflicts. So bring in those people to design it, and we'll see something very different.
Thanks very much, Scott. Aziz, you're very much the tour leader in all this in a way. You spend more time leading groups than anyone else on this in this conversation. What's your experience of actually doing it on the ground as a guide or tour leader? What would you say to somebody who's in that role now, doing that job around the world?
So I want to first say to Paige, that story you mentioned from your book is my favorite, and I think I might have told you that before. It's I think my favorite chapter as well in the book. It tells a beautiful story of what works well and what doesn't work. And being on the ground, you get to see that. You get to see what works well and what transforms people and what doesn't transform people. But perhaps the most important part is, what's my goal as a tour leader? Is my goal to just make my paycheck, or is it to really build a strong relationship between the travelers and locals, not just with me, but with the community, to make them truly fall in love with the place that are visiting? And you cannot love a place that you can't have a conversation with, that you do not see it to who it is. Just like with a human, you cannot love a human that you don't know the good and the bad and what's their struggles and what's their problems and what do they love and what do they eat in the morning and what time they like to wake up or go to bed. It's a relationship. And so without doing that, you don't fall in love with a place. If you do it, there are so many anecdotal examples I can give of people who truly fall in love with a place they visit because they know it and they don't want to disconnect from that place. Suddenly it becomes part of their lives. The travelers that will contact us and say, I want to be engaged, even without us telling them to. It's fascinating. Last 2 weeks ago, we gave out 19 scholarships to Palestinian girls in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Israel, and Gaza is now, there are no schools, so we couldn't do it there. That came out from one traveler who called us himself and said, I see what's going on. I know the first to suffer out of the current situation are girls and education. I want to give this much money, and was very, very generous donation to help these girls. Now, if he came to Israel and Palestine and only went sightseeing, he would never have done that. But he met the people, he cared about the people, and he said, I want to help. And I can give you, since the last year, so many examples. So that's one of my thoughts. I want to add one more, which is, I think the concept of peace and travel has always been connected. And I was thinking of poetry. Arabic poetry connects the two in many, many places. Even, I mean, I'm talking about poets who have nothing to do with the travel industry, and yet they use travel as a way to reimagine what peace looks like. And one of my favorite poems in that is by a Palestinian poet who's like a legend for many Palestinians. His name is Samih al-Qasim. And he wrote, the day I'm killed, my killer rifling through my pockets will find 3 tickets. 1 to peace, 1 to the fields and rain, and 1 to the conscience of a humankind. I beg you, my dear killer, don't ignore them. Don't waste such a thing, but take and use the tickets. Please, I beg you, go traveling. And this poem is one of those that brings our work in peace building and our work in travel very much together. Peace is a journey, and traveling is also a journey where you learn about peace, and the two of them can be connected.
So I think we've arrived at a point where we're saying that tourism and peace building can be mutually beneficial to each other. But I have a sense that we perhaps all feel that a lot more needs to be done by individuals who travel, by governments, and by the tourism businesses to make a reality of the opportunity. And that we're simply not doing enough to move tourism in that direction. Is that a fair summation of where we are? So tourism can contribute to peace, but only if we use tourism in that way and travel with open minds and speak less than we listen.
Yep.
Is that a fair way to sum it up?
Agree.
Can I thank you, Paige, Scott, and Aziz, for your time? And let's hope that over the next few years, tourism makes a bigger contribution to peace, because we're sure going to need it, given the problems we face as a species on this finite planet. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold.
Thank